somewhat defensive about those headlines because I think in the life of the nation, there is always a place for reaction and interaction between religious leaders and those in places of political power. I happened to be in that room that morning. Not everybody agreed as to what the president should do. Not everybody was of like mind on where the president should go politically and spiritually. There is at least implicit, if not explicit, criticism here of the ministers who have agreed to serve somewhat as counselors for the president in working through this matter. I think here again is a merger that I find very disturbing. The merger between a judgment that is couched in spirituality, which has to do with forgiveness and how forgiveness deals with the consequences of wrongdoing in an individual's life or in a family's life, and the political dimension or legal dimension or judicial dimension, which has to do with whether or not that person, forgiven or not spiritually, has the capacity to continue to lead the nation and by judgment of wrongdoing has the right to continue to lead the nation.
Mr. Jones, I'm going to take a call and then we'd like to hear your response to this. Boston, Massachusetts, reading the Globe on the moderate lines. Good morning.
Good morning.
What did you find in the paper?
Well, I'm reading the Boston Globe, the front page, which of course is every front page in the country. It's a process of Fridays, Saturday, and Sundays Boston Globes, and Fridays was Henry Hyde, and Saturdays was the Christian Coalition, which was shown on C-SPAN, and today's. And I'm glad that I have the two religious gentlemen on. About 2 months ago, I don't know if you remember, you interviewed, I'm talking to the woman now, a man named Reddick, James Reddick, I believe it was you, and he had written a book called The Anatomy of a Scandal, and in it he discussed Pat Robertson at great length, and how in the 1980s Pat Robertson was a business partner of Mobutu of Zaire, and at that same time Mobutu was being charged with crimes against, with war crimes against his own people, and he had stolen $400 million from the country, and Pat Robertson was a regular visitor over there in Zaire. Now, I'm not, this is something I heard on this very same program and went out and bought the book. And Friday, the Republicans are down there praising this man to the skies as a paragon of morality that we should look to for guidance in this crisis. And I'm thinking, wait a minute now. Mr. Reverend Gaddis just kind of stole my thunder in a couple of calls ago, in which he took a rather firm stand against letting these people guide us morally. I would like to, if there's any further comment these gentlemen may have about this issue.
Thanks very much. Bob Jones.
First of all, I think there's a problem playing a game of moral equivalence here. I don't, frankly, at base, see this as a moral issue. And I think in part Clinton has brought the excruciating examination of his personal life on himself. It is, in fact, a political issue. And he is crippled as a president. He is blurring the lines, the constitutional lines, between the executive branch and the judicial branch. There are all kinds of political reasons why this president shouldn't remain in office, regardless of how you feel about his moral faults. And so when we start criticizing the Republicans in Congress for releasing the videotape, I say, you know, step back for a minute and look at why this is necessary. It's Clinton who's brought this down to a matter of you know, healing myself and healing my family and all these sorts of things. So if you're going to make it a personal issue, then you've got to keep it on that personal level and say, let's see if he's really sorry. Let's see if he's really being repentant or not.
Dr. Gaddy, how comfortable were you mentioned at the outset you're concerned that all sides were trying to position themselves. How comfortable with you with the White House's release of the names of the 3 ministers who would be guiding the president spiritually?
I was very uncomfortable with that. I think and if you probably remember, one of the three was not disclosed until a day or two later because he refused to identify himself as one of the counselors. No, I think this is the matter of the president counseling with spiritual leaders is very much in order, but that should be a very private matter, and I really hope to see nothing else in the press about that.
Next call for our two guests is from Robinson Township, Pennsylvania, reading the Tribune Review on our conservative lines. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm a first-time caller.
Welcome. Do you have a story for us today?
Well, it's a legacy of regret and remorse. But I want to talk to Dr. Gaddy first. There are two things I would like to say. First of all, the Christian Coalition, as far as I'm concerned, is to the left of what the American mainstream was in the early 50s. That just goes to show where the doctor is as far as calling the Christian Coalition extreme right. And so many of the pundits are so far to the left it's not even funny, because nobody in the Christian Coalition, I believe, expects to revive the blue laws we had, about that the Lord's Prayer would be prayed in public school, that God would come back in and Ten Commandments, and you could actually teach, read the Bible in school and teach from it. We have gone so far to the left.
From ABC News, Washington. This Week with Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts, featuring George Will.
This week, the House Judiciary Committee votes to release President Clinton's taped grand jury testimony amidst charges of partisanship and unfairness.
What we have is a very one-sided partisan effort to release material before the president gets a chance to review it or respond to it that makes the president look bad.
There was a general view among the Democrats not to reveal anything, and there was a general view among Republicans to reveal as much as possible.
We'll talk to two key members of the House Judiciary Committee, Republican Congressman Asa Hutchinson and Democrat Marty Meehan.
And this week, Judiciary Chairman Henry Hyde becomes the latest target of a suspected scorched earth campaign.
The Republican leadership has sent a letter to FBI Director Louis Freeh asking that he investigate allegations that certain associates and allies of the White House have embarked on an effort to intimidate members of Congress.
Republicans and the media are pointing fingers at White House aide Sydney Blumenthal. We'll talk to his lawyer, William McDaniel.
And our roundtable discussion with ABC's George Stephaoupolis and Bill Kristol.
The president's videotaped testimony as political temperatures rise this Sunday morning.
Good morning. It was a rough week for President Clinton. Many of the nation's newspapers called on him to resign. Democrats on Capitol Hill expressed more and more distress with the president. And that distress was added to by the fact that there were stories about Chairman Henry Hyde and rumors that other Republicans might have their past revealed, Sam.
And Cokie, we'll be talking to William McDaniel, the attorney for Sydney Blumenthal, a White House aide who is widely suspected of being the person who has disseminated these stories about Hyde and others. Mr. Blumenthal denies this. But before we do that, let's begin by calling in two members of the House Judiciary Committee. Republican Asa Hutchinson from Springfield, Missouri, Democrat Marty Meehan from Foxborough, Massachusetts. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Thank you for being with us. And with us, as always, to join in the questioning, George Will. Gentlemen, is this a partisan witch hunt? Is this something that the Republicans are determined to use to bring down a president? And are Democrats simply determined to support that president outside of the facts? Mr. Hutchinson?
Well, certainly not. We've started a process that follows the Constitution, and also we're following the mandate of the House. 2/3 of the Democrats in the House supported the release of all the materials and voted for it. But when we got down to the committee level, the Democrats decided not to follow the mandate of the House and opposed that. I think it's important that the American people would be able to evaluate this evidence as we do in Congress, so that whatever we decide, hopefully the American people will confirm and support.
Mr. Meehan, you're a Democrat. What do you have to say to that?
Well, first of all, the House voted to let the Judiciary Committee decide which information shouldn't be released by September 28th. But the Judiciary Committee rushed into it and started releasing material, or will release material right away. I think we should have waited at least until members had an opportunity to go through this information. The bottom line here is I think that the debate for a day and a half in the Judiciary Committee was very unfortunate. I thought it was partisan, and frankly, it was a sobering experience. I felt that Republicans came into the meeting knowing how they were going to vote, and I think we're in for a difficult time if we can't come to some kind of a bipartisan agreement.
But with all due respect, didn't you come into the meeting, you Democrats, knowing how you were going to vote?
No, not at all. The first thing we wanted to see was have the public able to view the proceedings. I don't think it should have been in closed session. I think the public had a right to hear what both sides were in terms of the arguments for whether or not the information should be released.
May I respond?
Please.
Certainly, I'm from Arkansas, and I don't think we want anything but a fair process here. But it would be ridiculous for us to discuss whether these confidential materials should be redacted or released in open session. That would defeat the purpose. I think that's really a ridiculous statement that could be made. We carefully reviewed these materials. I personally spent many hours down at the Ford building, look at these. I had a standard that we should not release anything more graphic than what has already been done, protect privacy interests, but at the same time fulfill the mandate of the House, which was a bipartisan support, 2/3 of the Democrats, the Republicans supported releasing this material. A lot has to be done before September 28th, and this is a fair start. It's also balanced.
99% of the debate could have been in public. There were only a couple of times when we would have had to go into closed section.
Meehan,
the American people had a right to hear that.
What about that point, though, that Congressman Hutchinson is making? 2/3 of the Democrats did vote to release the material. You happened to vote against it, as did most of the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee. Are you seeing a different group of Democrats on the committee than there is in the House as a whole?
No, what I'm saying is the House voted to give until the 28th of September for the Judiciary Committee to decide which information should not be released, and those items that the Judiciary Committee decides shouldn't be held back would be released by the 28th.
What would be the advantage of that? Some Democrats are worried that the dribbling out the information over a long period of time would be more injurious to the president.
Well, I don't know what the political advantages may or may not be. You could debate that, but the reality is members of the Judiciary Committee have a major responsibility here, and we're setting precedent for future generations. And the reality is to just be releasing information before we've really had an opportunity to go through all the information, I think, sets a dangerous precedent. It certainly isn't the way that Judge John Sirica and Leon Jaworski operated during Watergate. I think that we can do better and establish a process. We haven't even discussed what conduct is impeachable conduct, or what the procedures are going to be.
Congressman Hutchinson, is this a Democratic tactic to try to portray you as extreme Republicans?
Well, there's no question about it that we would have been being attacked for being unfair regardless of what we would have done. We're following the mandate of the House. I noticed that.
But is there a danger that there will be a backlash against you?
Well, certainly, that if we do not act fairly and what we do is perceived as fair, then we're going to be criticized. And so it's very treacherous what we're going through. And that gives us a strong incentive to do what is right, to follow the Constitution and be fair and bipartisan. Our minds are not made up. We're following a process that's been initiated by a set of facts and by the law with a report from the independent counsel. We don't have any choice in this matter. The President's actions have dictated what we're having to do right now, and we have a duty to do, and we really need to end the shrill voices so that we can concentrate in a reasoned fashion on doing this.
George? Can I respond? Because I have to tell you, I'm one member of Congress who have worked in a bipartisan way. Chris Shays, a Republican from Connecticut, and I just got a campaign finance bill through the House. Jim Hansen and I have the major tobacco bill. Bob Franks and I have been working on manufacturing issues. I know what bipartisanship is. It's give and take, it's discussions back and forth, it's joint decision making. What we experienced in the Judiciary Committee was not joint decision-making. I've never seen such partisanship, and partisanship has to be two-way. Chairman Hyde wrote a letter without even informing the minority or the full committee, wrote a letter to the judge in the Paula Jones case to get that videotape as well. That's not the way you go about getting evidence.
Let's let George Will get in here. George?
Mr. Meehan, a number of Democrats have said that perjury before a grand jury is grounds for impeachment. The president insists he has not committed perjury. At the prayer breakfast, after he was done expressing his contrition, he said he would have his lawyers mount an aggressive defense of him against the charge of perjury. Given that that is, in a sense, a gauntlet thrown down, what choice did the committee have but to release the other side, which is the president's testimony?
The committee didn't have to release the information without looking at it. Many of the members of the committee, and Asa was down looking at this evidence, but many of the members of the committee never got down to even look at the evidence. It's highly unusual to have a videotape of a president, and by the way, the prosecutors aren't on this tape. It's only the president. That's all highly unusual, and if you look at the precedent that was established in Watergate, you didn't have this. I just think that with something like impeachment, we ought to be doing everything we can to have bipartisanship as we get down the road here, and we're not off to a very good start. In fact, it was a very sobering experience.
George, hold your other questions, and we'll be back with both Representatives Hutchinson and Meehan in just a moment.
From ABC News, This Week with Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts. Brought to you by GE. From Air...
Seeing what the country will be seeing tomorrow sometime, the grand jury testimony tape. Some people say there'll be a backlash in favor of the president. Some people say the country will be appalled. Mr. Hutchinson, what's the truth?
Well, I've seen the videotape, I've reviewed the transcript, and I think it certainly has more value as evidence than entertainment. Quite frankly, large portions of it is rather boring. And the president has indicated that he didn't get into the details. He simply stated his case. And so I think that what's good about this is the American people will be able to evaluate this without having to be filtered through the media or through the opinions of members of Congress. This videotape came about because the president was given special consideration in view of his office. And that's the only reason this exists. And so it should be evaluated with all the materials. We need to remember that there's other grand jury testimony, other evidence that will be released tomorrow as well.
Congressman Meehan?
First of all, George, I think that future presidents will walk in to the courthouse and give their testimony there to avoid there being a videotape of the proceedings. I think, frankly, that those people in America that really don't like the president will think the president looks terrible. I think that people who like the president or that are neutral, I don't think it'll have a great positive or negative effect. I think the president comes across answering some difficult questions. He does reasonably well. I think there's been much ado made about this. I thought the president did a fairly reasonably good job. I don't think it'll have a political effect.
Then why are you so concerned about releasing it if that's the case?
Well, I can tell you as a former prosecutor, we just shouldn't be releasing information that members of the committee haven't even looked at. For example,
whose fault is that? Why haven't they looked at it? They could have gone and looked at it.
Well, in many cases, members haven't had time to get there. But Asa has been there, and Asa has looked at much of the evidence. My point is this. I think that what we need to do is go through a process where both sides are talking, both sides are establishing what the procedures are, rather than just letting a tape go on the air. There are many Republican candidates that are talking about using the tape in political ads.
So, Congressman Hutchins?
Well, you look back, Dick Gephardt and the Speaker had a news conference that talked about how we're going to approach this in bipartisan fashion and set up the procedure. For the first time, they've been talking about these things. We had a bipartisan vote on the floor. We were in committee, and we discussed this for 2 days in typical fashion Judiciary Committee. Bipartisanship has to build. If you look back at the Watergate proceedings, it started out with a little bit of rancor, particularly in the public airways. But as time went on, you're able to build that. And I want to reach out to Mr. Meehan. I'm committed to fully listen to this and debate this, and I think everybody on the committee should have that attitude. And I think we can do this, but we need to portray it not just in the committee, but also out in public.
Let me jump in here and ask the meaning of the word "this." I mean, it's popular now to parse words right down to exact words. What is this? I know some Americans think that what the president has admitted to, this relationship with Monica Lewinsky, is awful enough to try to force him from office. And then other Americans think the lying to the public, as well as to his staff and to his cabinet and everybody else, is awful enough to force him from office. And there's a third group that says if the president has committed crimes against the federal code, felonies, perjury, obstruction of justice, as alleged by Starr, witness tampering, then of course he can't stay in office. Where do you come down? What is this, Mr. Hutchinson?
Well, there's only, all of these facts have to be viewed in light of the Constitution, which sets up a very strict standard. And so what we look at is perjury, we look at obstruction of justice. Those are the key issues in this case. And when you look at perjury, you can't put it in compartments and say, well, if it's about this subject, it doesn't matter. If it's about that subject, it does matter. And so the perjury is the key issue. And as far as I'm concerned, everything else is a backdrop to it. It should diminish in our public discourse, and we need to concentrate on the truth and what that outcome should be.
Mr. Meehan, I want to ask you the same question about what is this, but pick up on that last point. The perjury law, for instance, does not read, comma, except if it's about sex, or, comma, except if it's a civil suit. Do you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think that there are the facts of a case, for example, if someone lies about sex in a civil suit where it wasn't a material fact and was thrown out, legally there'd be some mitigating circumstances. But the reality is this legalist type of arguments back and forth really doesn't mean anything to the Judiciary Committee. We have to determine whether the president's actions rise to a bribery, a treasonry, high crimes, or misdemeanor. Frankly, I don't see very much in the report that rises to that level. We've got a major problem. We've had a president who's guilty of some behavior that he ought to have to be accountable for. It seems to me that we ought to reflect and seriously consider the cost of this investigation, the cost of impeachment is going to have on the public discourse in America, the cost on the institution of the presidency, and frankly, I think
go ahead. I'm just going to ask you, if in fact, however, you determine in your committee that the president is guilty of these crimes, what is the cost of not impeaching him?
Well, certainly if the president were guilty of obstruction of justice or lying before a criminal grand jury, that would rise to the level. But what I'm concerned about is I don't think, frankly, there's an open and shut case on any of those.
Mr. Hutchinson, where are the various costs here? The cost of impeaching him to the country, the turmoil and all of that?
No, not the cost of impeaching him, but the cost of public discourse in America, the cost of the institution of the presidency, the cost to America's global leadership role. All of those things we're paying a price for.
Mr. Hutchinson, give me your view of the costs here.
Well, I think we have to look at it in terms of our Constitution and our institutions of democracy and what the costs are and the price that we pay, and we have to, it's a fair debate, and that's what we have to go through.
And what about, just very briefly, this extra constitutional concept that's being floated by a lot of the president's friends of something like censure and fine?
Well, what we have to concentrate on is the constitutional responsibility. Okay. Censure, to me, is a different direction. We need to concentrate on what the committee should do in terms of reviewing this for whether impeachment inquiry should go forward.
Thank you. We're out of time. Thank you, Congressman Hutchinson. Thank you, Congressman Meehan.
Thank you.
Next, is the White House behind recent stories exposing the private scandals of Republican politicians? We'll talk to William McDaniel, the attorney for White House aide Sydney Blumenthal.
Just a thought, that's what Einstein said. Just a view of the future 2 paces ahead. Think about me, think about you, all the good things, a little good thing.
In the past, reporters are brought to me rumors about the private lives of members of Congress. When they did so, I told them this was wrong, they shouldn't publish it, and I would have no part of it. And then in the final sentence, Mr. Blumenthal said, I never brought such rumors to the attention of any reporter. Now, did that statement mean to be all-inclusive? That never, at any time, did he bring a rumor about a peccadillo, sexual or otherwise, about a member of Congress to the attention of any reporter?
Well, I think he was referring there to the Hyde story. He did not ever bring the Hyde story to the attention of any reporter, and that's true. I think it's clear, based upon what Salon Magazine has said, and based upon yesterday's article in the Boston Globe, which conducted an inquiry into this matter, that Sydney Blumenthal didn't have anything to do with instigating this story. He wasn't a source for it. He didn't urge anybody to report it. It was discussed with him. As I understand it, this source for the story, this person from Florida who was mentioned in your report, talked to over 50 news organizations in the last couple of months about this story. And reporters called up Sydney and asked him about it. And in each case, he told them, I don't think you ought to publish this, and I don't want anything to do with it.
Mr. McDaniel, ABC News, as I said, has reported that we have talked to 2 individuals who have told us that Mr. Blumenthal discussed the Henry Hyde story with them. Now, are they lying?
Do you have their names? Because if you do, I'd like to write them down and talk to them face to face.
We have their names, but we, of course, promised them confidentiality, as we had to when they spoke to us. But we are putting the faith of credibility of ABC News behind what we've just said to you.
Well, I've read every story about this that I could find, and I have yet to see anybody who says, I talked to Sydney Blumenthal. It's always, I talked to somebody who talked to Sydney Blumenthal, and I'm not going to tell you who that person is. Now, I'd like that person to come forward and say, I talked to Sydney Blumenthal, and he told me these things, because it's false. And
well, if such a person came forward, as you know, that would be contradicting not only his public statement, but as I understand it, his sworn testimony under oath.
Well, he testified under oath about, about the prosecutors. It's part and parcel of this. The Star's prosecutors hauled him down there and asked him all kinds of questions about whether he was peddling rumors about them.
Well, let's talk about that. And in an article in The Nation magazine, Doug Ireland wrote about Sydney Blumenthal and the prosecutors and said, 3 members of the media have confirmed to me that Sydney Blumenthal, the White House media counselor, had indeed been spreading such stories. They heard him do it. These were stories that members of the Star team were gay.
Yes. He didn't name any of those people. Again, it's this anonymous thing. Someone said this. I'm not going to tell you who they are, but somebody said this, and that's false. And I'd like to know the names of those people, too. And the prosecutors took Mr. Blumenthal down to the grand jury, and, they didn't ask him one question about that, about whether he was spreading salacious stories about them. They put stuff out in the newspaper that that's what they were interested in, but when push came to shove, they didn't ask one question about it. And when they sent their report up to Capitol Hill, there's no mention of it. So that report by Mr. Ireland in The Nation is, I don't know who he was depending on because he won't tell us. That was false.
Don't you think it's passing strange that all of these rumors come back to Mr. Blumenthal?
Well, I don't know why that is, but I know what the facts are in these matters. And I've carefully investigated the facts in these matters. I mean, Mr. Will reported on this show 2 weeks ago, and he said it just as though he knew it was true that Mr. Blumenthal was doing this. But Mr. Blumenthal didn't talk to Mr. Will about it. Mr. Will didn't call Mr. Blumenthal. He didn't call the White House. He didn't ask Mr. Blumenthal about it. What Mr. Will did was rely upon somebody else. Now, I don't know who he relied upon because he didn't say, and he's probably not going to say today. But what you get here is this type of innuendo, and this representative DeLay engaged in the same thing. You get this character assassination by innuendo. And I deal in a world where if you got something to say about somebody, you stand up and say it, and you put your name behind it.
Let me ask you this. If, in fact, he had, or anyone, let's take Mr. Blumenthal out of it, if, in fact, anyone in the White House had said to a reporter, it's a little odd that Henry Hyde is the guy who's heading up this investigation because I remember stories about him and a girlfriend. Would that be appropriate?
I don't think it would be appropriate. I don't think it's illegal. It's not something that I would want to see my client engage in, and it's not something I would do.
Does that fall within, has his statement parsed this so that if he said something like that, it's not urging or peddling, it's just saying?
I don't think that if you say to somebody in a casual conversation, the door's open everywhere now, and a lot of this stuff's going to come out, or people have to be careful. That's appearing everywhere. Everybody's saying that. But what he did not do on this Hyde story, and what he has never done on any member of Congress, is urge any reporter to go dig up information about the private lives of a member of Congress or pass it on to somebody.
You said in response just now to Cokie that would be inappropriate but not illegal. In your original letter to ABC News, to President of ABC News, David Weston, you said that the accusations against Mr. Blumenthal were false and defamatory. So if true, Mr. Blumenthal's behavior would be infamous, you're saying?
No, I think it would be something which would tend to lessen his reputation. That's what defamatory means.
And should lessen his reputation?
Yeah, I don't like that kind of behavior in our public life, and I don't think many people do.
In the letter of September 10th to David Weston, you said that Sydney Blumenthal never attempted to smear. Is it your understanding or your client's understanding that the dissemination of a true story cannot by definition be a smear?
No, that's not what I meant by that.
Okay, what did you mean?
What I meant by that was he did not disseminate that true story about Henry Hyde. Because as I understand it, that story's true. And I understood that to be what you were referring to, Mr. Will, was that story about Mr. Hyde. And what I meant when I said that, I was using your language because you used the word smear, that he didn't do that. And my letter in its entirety said that he didn't peddle that information or distribute it or disseminate it. And you know, I got a reply from ABC News about this, and it was a very carefully written reply from,
well, I
from
got
the
it right
president.
here.
Well,
and
you've got it there. I think you ought to look at what it was Mr. Weston, who's a very capable lawyer. I know Mr. Weston for a long time, a very careful and capable lawyer who's the head of ABC News, what he said there. He didn't say, we have information that Sydney Blumenthal peddled this story about Henry Hyde. He said, first of all, we have information that Sydney Blumenthal discussed.
Has indeed had discussions, and you said that that statement was meaningless.
Yes.
Why is it meaningless? You went on to say it's meaningless, and Mr. Blumenthal neither urged nor peddled.
Yes.
Are those the operative terms?
Yes. Reporters called Mr. Blumenthal, as he said in his statement, and discussed this with him.
Well, wait, what's dissemination? You said in your letter, disseminate.
Yes.
If he is telling reporters this without urging them to do anything, it's still disseminating.
That's not what I said.
He says, I never brought such rumors to the attention of any reporter.
That's correct. Reporters called him and said, I've got this guy calling me up.
So he did discuss this information with reporters?
Yes, and it said so in his statement.
But your assertion, well, you have to look through. What is the meaning of this, in other words? What is the meaning of brought to the attention? So you're saying he discussed the story with Henry Hyde, but only when reporters asked him about it?
Yes, yes. And he told them, I don't think you ought to publish this, and I don't want to be part of it. And that letter doesn't say you have any information to the contrary.
You could help us out. I had to say, as all news organizations do, that we would protect our source. You could, on behalf of Mr. Blumenthal today, ask our sources to let us off of that, discharge that, release us from that pledge of confidentiality. And if they will do that, we'll name them in a moment. Go ahead.
I can ask them to release it. How do I have any power to do that?
On behalf of your client. Well, if you don't.
I want to hear their names. Sure, and I don't have pieces of paper.
Well, ask them to come forward then and release us from our pledge of confidentiality, and we'll tell you their names.
That's fine with me. Have them come forward.
Would it be all right with your client? Have you consulted your client?
I don't know what you mean by all right. My client has no power to control these people. I'd like to hear their names.
Well, I think if he asked them to come forward and said, I release you from any pledge of confidentiality, they would consider that very strongly.
Sam's point is that they feel bound by confidentiality to protect your client.
Oh, no, let's hear the names. I haven't discussed it with my client, but I know what's happened. Let's hear the names.
Why isn't your client here, Mr. McDaniel? He's a member of the president's media staff. Yeah. Why isn't he out talking to the media?
There's two reasons. One is he's in New York because the Prime Minister of Great Britain and the President of Italy and other people are coming to meet with the President Monday, and he's there for that. And the other is that if he comes, I don't get to come on the show, and my mother would be gravely disappointed at that.
Well, let's give your mother some more entertainment here. Mr. Blumenthal says that he is not in any way involved with this story on Henry Hyde. Now, we're all lawyers here these days. The antecedent of the pronoun this, is that meaning Salon's publication of this story?
No, that means the total story about Mr. Hyde, whether it was in Salon or anywhere else.
Salon, in an interview with the San Francisco Examiner, has said that Salon rushed this story into print because it learned that two political operatives, quote unquote, were leaking details of the Hyde affair. One operative, according to the Salon source, was Terry Lenzner, a private investigator, and the other's not named. You're categorically saying that the second was not Mr. Blumenthal.
I am saying that, yes.
Okay.
You know, it is said that Mr. Blumenthal is very close to the First Lady, Mrs. Clinton, and suspicious minds believe she somehow, going back to her statement about a vast right-wing conspiracy, is the author of the so-called scorched earth policy, if indeed one exists. Do you know anything about the relationship there?
No, it's not my province. I represent Mr. Blumenthal on certain legal matters, and those other things really aren't my business, and I don't know anything about them.
How do you think this is going to end?
The thing with the president?
The thing with your client?
Well, the thing with my client is going to end with he's not going to be charged with anything, and if I can find out who's spreading these rumors about him, I'm going to have some more lawsuits on my hands. That's how this is going to end if I can help it. And I don't know when or where I'm going to find this stuff out, but I'm anxious to find it out and proceed with it.
Well, if people who are listening today, who were our sources, heed your advice and release us from our pledge of confidentiality, you'll have plenty of business.
Good. Send me the names.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you very much for having me.
I appreciate you coming in
Thank you.
today. Well, coming up next, our weekly roundtable with ABC News analyst Bill Kristol and George Stephaoupolis in a moment.
thinking that maybe the president was all right, that the Starr report wasn't as bad as they had expected it to be. And by the time the week was over, you were hearing more and more Democrats, at least privately, say that they thought that the president should resign and that they just didn't have the nerve to go tell him. I'm not quite sure what happened in the course of that week. Bill Kristol, George Stephaoupolis, either one of you have a clue?
Well, I think that all the facts finally settled in on people. And I'm not saying that that's going to lead to impeachment, but it felt during the course of the week like the president was standing on quicksand and just slowly sinking in Washington. It was a very ugly week in Washington, but I think the best evidence of the kind of trouble the president is in comes from Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania. There was a trial this week for a 15-year-old kid who was accused of torching a barn. And when he was brought forward to the judge, he denied it. And his lawyer invoked the Clinton defense, saying that it's just a human reaction to lie. And I think this is the long-term problem for the president. People cannot accept that he didn't tell the truth, and they need to see him punished for it, even if that punishment isn't impeachment.
At the moment on Capitol Hill, I think the president is adding to his own problems with his own party. In the Nixon impeachment, almost to the very end, President Nixon maintained that he was telling the truth. He was not, of course. But Republicans up there who believed in him could say, I don't care what the evidence as it accumulates shows. He continues to say he's telling the truth. This president, asked this past week by Terry Hunter of the Associated Press at a news conference, words to the effect, Mr. President, is Monica Lewinsky telling the truth? And do you still assert that you were not perjuring yourself? You didn't lie under oath? Instead of giving direct answers, it was the old shuffle. So if you're on Capitol Hill going to defend the guy and he's shuffling in the background, where are you standing? Your word is appropriate, on quicksand.
Cokie's question is what happened this week. And what happened this week is that the country did something some people think it had forgotten how to do, which is blush. It's been said that man's the only animal that blushes or needs to. And the country really got embarrassed this week. And I think that's, again, legalities all aside. The modern presidency has this peculiar intimacy. 19th century president could walk down the street in most American cities and not be recognized. Presidents nowadays are in our living rooms. The question is, do people want this in their living room?
Well, and a lot more of it in the living rooms. But Bill, did you sense a change on the part of Republicans as they looked at this week too?
Not really. I think the real story was the Democrats and the emergence of really two Democratic parties on the Hill and in the country. One, and the first thing that happened this week was Senator Daschle and Congressman Gephardt's statement on Monday chastising the president for depending on, excuse me, legalistic defenses and saying the president has failed to meet a basic standard of truthfulness. That very night, the Democratic National Chairman, Steve Grossman, stands up at a huge fundraiser in New York City with the president and praises him for the moral leadership to this country he has provided that has enriched the life of virtually every citizen. You really do have two...
You're just trying to raise money there. I mean, that wasn't going to the heart of the argument, trying to get a little cash.
No, but seriously, and then you've seen that on the Hill this week. You've seen the Judiciary Committee Democrats, most of them defending the president. You've seen other Democrats distancing themselves. And I think the story over the next couple of weeks is not a Republican story. It's does the Democratic Party follow the lead of Joe Lieberman, or does it follow the lead of Stephen Grossman?
But there are two different things going on here. The Democratic Party is clearly upset with the president's behavior and has to figure out a way to deal with that. But as always, the president has been lucky in his enemies. And the overreaching of the House Judiciary Committee, the overreaching, the kind of bloodthirstiness...
What was the overreaching?
Rushing. There's no reason to rush all of this out. This
what is
appearance
the advantage of not rushing? I mean, it seems to me that it's worse for the Democrats if they dribble it out right up to the election.
The advantage of not rushing is being fair and appearing to be fair. And the way they work this out, they united the Democrats because they say this is not due process. It may not have been politically smart, but it would be, I think the country would appreciate it if the process looked more fair.
A word about partisanship. 13 days before Richard Nixon resigned, the House Judiciary Committee took its vote on Article 1 of impeachment, and it voted 27 to 11 against the president. Every Democrat voted for impeachment, and 11 of the 17 Republicans, 13 to 4 right, voted no. 6 Republican heroes, in my judgment, broke ranks to vote against their president. So to say at the outset it's partisan, of course, that's what our two-party system is all about.
It seems to me, too, that there's hardly anything that the Republicans could do that the Democrats wouldn't say partisan, because that's the best argument. That's the best case, is to say the Republicans are acting like those bad old Republicans
Cokie, I think that's
again.
exactly right, but as you pointed out, the Democrats aren't that eager to rush to the defense here, but they'll take any opportunity they've given, and the Republicans gave them the opportunity.
Much of the argument, reportedly, we don't know for sure, but the reports are that much of the argument in the Judiciary Committee concerned whether or not they should release information about whether the president touched Ms. Lewinsky's breast. Now, why are we doing this? We're doing this because the president has taken a very aggressive stand, saying that, in fact, he has this particular understanding of sexual relations and he's not guilty and he did not perjure himself. And he announced again at the prayer breakfast that his lawyers were going to conduct an aggressive defense. In a way, he started this.
Well, George is right, I think.
He started the whole thing.
Yes, but I mean, he started this particular phase that compelled, in the eyes of the Republicans on the committee, to release the tape.
I'll tell you something else interesting that I saw this week. You really are seeing regional differences, and this is part of the reason the national polls are not having as much effect on members of Congress as you would expect them to. A lot of New Yorkers and Californians in those national polls, and when you talk to members from the Midwest, they are hearing nothing but complaints from their districts. And then this very interesting thing happening with Southern members, several of whom I think would have by now called for the president's resignation, except that they're hearing very strong countervailing arguments from their African-American constituents. So there really is a lot of listening to the people going on.
If the White House thinks that the Scorched Earth campaign is the way to counter this push against the president, they are only adding to his
But Sam, the White House clearly doesn't think that. The White House has gone out of its way to say, regardless of what Mr. Blumenthal may or may not have done, that it's not an appropriate policy. This is the worst thing in the world for the White House to be seen behind this.
But you told us back last February that this was going to happen.
I said several months ago that White House allies were saying, we're going to do this.
You used
and
plural.
they have. And
allies.
I said allies of the White House, not the White House. And that caused the White House to say, we don't want to be a part of this. Now it's gone out of control.
Well, George, is it your understanding that no one in the White House has been doing this?
It's my understanding that I've talked to John Podesta in the White House. He said, if you know of a person who's doing it, we will fire him in a heartbeat. I have never been called by anybody in the White House over the last several months peddling a story.
Well,
that does not mean it doesn't happen.
Inviting you out.
Or invited to dinner. Right?
Look, wait a second. The President of the United States over these 7.5 months has never, in his own voice, repudiated this strategy. He's had plenty of opportunities to. The article in The Nation that we cited earlier on the show, in which Doug Ireland, a liberal Democrat from New York, cites Sydney Blumenthal as spreading rumors about the sexual proclivities of Ken Starr's deputies, that appeared on March 30th, 1998. That is a long time ago.
Let's be fair, he's never been asked, to the best of my knowledge, a direct question. And of course, as we've seen, he has tried not to discuss this subject at all.
But it's easy to say Clinton allies, but you know the president can control his allies and his staff.
Well, he can't control every ally. There's one other point here, though. This is wrong activity. It probably shouldn't have been done. Who knows who did it? But it's also not criminal activity. And the idea that the Republicans in Congress are calling for an FBI investigation of this has got to stop.
Yeah, exactly. Again, we come back to the fact that we're talking about public opinion here, and will public opinion drive the process? The process is going to pull public opinion along because it is simply untenable, it seems to me, for almost any Democrat on the Judiciary Committee to vote against the next step.
Well,
and once the gavel falls, everything follows by logic.
Well, that's what we'll talk about, the next step, when we come back in just a minute.
Who are these people?
We are forever grateful that you have brought the blessings of peace and justice to the people of Northern Ireland. And we pledge our enthusiastic and unending support for you as you take us on that journey. Ladies and gentlemen, the Paula Dwyer Award to William Jefferson.
Well, tomorrow we're going to see the president's testimony on videotape, 4+ hours of it. Congressman Hutchinson has warned us that bits of it are boring, but I think that we were likely to have a lot of people tuning in. Bill, how bad is this going to be for the president?
I talked to someone who's seen the videotape of the testimony this week, and I said, is it going to be full of these sexual details that we don't really need to know about? He said, there'll be some, but that's not the story. He said, it's not the sex, stupid, it's the perjury, that you have for 4 hours someone going out of his way to try not to tell the truth, or at least the whole truth. And I really think that's the story. The New York Times this morning reports on has the written statement the president will read at the beginning of the testimony. The very first sentence is a lie. When I was alone with Ms. Lewinsky on certain occasions in early 1996 and once in 97, I had inappropriate contact. Why early 96? The truth is the first contact was November 1995.
She was an intern.
Because he doesn't want it to begin when she was an intern. And apparently, when you look at it, you just see instance after instance of shading and ducking the truth.
Well, according to Ms. Lewinsky, I mean, she is saying it was 95. How bad it
you
is,
know,
I
as you
think.
pointed out before, the president has never, and his lawyer last week did not say that Ms. Lewinsky was lying.
Well, he's had the opportunity to do that. How bad is it? I think we only have to take the question that we know a member of the jury sent forward to ask. And the prosecutors, the jury's watching back on, you know, their television closed circuit. And a member of the jury sent forward a question to ask the president, why aren't you answering the questions? Ladies and gentlemen, if someone can answer direct questions and satisfy a jury or any of us, we're going to go home. When they don't answer the question, you know they got a problem, and you're going to go forward with the criminal case.
That is the real problem. I think both Bill and Sam are right. What's going to linger is the questions about perjury. And I think that's big trouble for the president as a movie that's more likely to be Rashomon. People are going to see this, and there are going to be moments when the president looks sympathetic. Anybody who's ever faced a grand jury, I've unfortunately done it 5 times, it is a harrowing, stressful experience, and I think people can relate to that. They'll see moments of humor, they'll see moments of anger. That won't matter. What matters is the perjury.
Will they see a moment when he looks presidential? Because at the end of the day, that's the question, is can he conduct the office? It's a largely rhetorical office. Politics is mostly talk.
Well, does it start with him being read his rights, for instance?
Well, and this is the real problem. What George is talking about, the most memorable words of the Clinton presidency right now are not from a single speech he has ever given. Not from the first inaugural, not from the second inaugural. It's the denial of sexual relations, it's the admission, it's the grand jury testimony.
But according to a source who's seen the tape, and I haven't, it starts with the president arguing about whether he should take the oath.
No, but it turns out that it's the prosecution arguing with him, asking him if he knows the meaning of the whole truth.
Well, yes, because in this case, the president parses words so carefully. The whole truth. What is your definition of the whole truth, sir?
What's most likely here is probably a double backlash. The White House has been hoping for a backlash against the Republicans. It's probably going to be a pox on all your houses.
The country just wants it over. Now, this changed in July when the country woke up and said, there's only one way to get this over, and it's not to get rid of Ken Starr, it's to get rid of the president.
Well, so now some Democrats are saying the way to get it over is to do some kind of deal, like you suggested last week, I think, censure plus, you know, take a year's salary away, go into his pension.
Before the November elections, Democrats need an occasion to cast a vote against the president. They will get it in the Judiciary Committee, which, for all our talk this week about how divided it is, when push comes to shove, how many members of the Judiciary Committee can vote no, saying there is no ground for proceeding with an impeachment?
The vote you refer to is to proceed to a formal impeachment investigation. You say what can be done as a deal? Mario Cuomo, the former governor of New York, good Democrat that he is, suggests that the deal ought to be allowing this president to finish his term, and the moment he finishes, into the criminal dock to face criminal charges of perjury. I said, Governor, do you think he's going to risk that? The governor suggests that maybe he'd win. And maybe he wouldn't.
It's my information at this point that there's nobody to deal with, Bill. It's a non-starter with Republicans.
Right, they don't want to deal, and I think they're right not to. You cannot have a weakened president for 2 years. Let's get it over with, as Pat Moynihan said on this show 2 weeks ago. If people decide it doesn't reach the gravity of an impeachable offense, let's have a vote on the full floor of the House not to impeach. Otherwise, impeach and move it on to the Senate. And at that point, I think Daschle goes to him and he resigns. This will happen soon.
There will be a deal in the Senate. There will eventually be a deal in the Senate.
After the House has voted to impeach?
I'm not sure about that. After the election.
Will the deal leave the president as president?
Yes.
No.
Democrats cannot avoid voting for an inquiry. Republicans in the end will say, we cannot throw a president out of office when the underlying offense as bad as the perjury is, when the underlying offense is sex, and there will be 40, 45 votes in the Senate
George,
against
we need to
impeachment.
change the law. So we say perjury is a criminal offense, comma, except when it's about sex.
Wait, so we need to change but what you're saying is the House of Representatives actually impeaches.
I'm saying it's conceivable that there will be a
Senate.
partisan vote in the House of Representatives to impeach. It's conceivable over the issue
I
of
tell you, if this
perjury.
evidence
The Senate
tests
will
out.
never remove the president from office, and they shouldn't, because the Constitution never
when will this
contemplated
come
that we'd be in a
to the
situation
Senate?
like this.
After the election?
Yes.
After January?
That's
there may be 58, 59, 60 Republicans. There may be 7 Democrats who would join with them and say, again, the question's going to be, is this an appropriate president?
Well, also, what does it mean to have the House of Representatives vote impeachment? We're really getting into some very dicey here. I understand,
but if it's a partisan vote, it's more difficult to carry forward.
You're right, but they surely were going to have Democratic votes in order to sustain it, just as in Mr. Nixon's case, they did get some Republican votes. If the evidence tests out, Monica Lewinsky, is she telling the truth? Then he's cooked.
We'll talk about this more. Sam and I will be back in a moment.
This Week with Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts. Brought to you by ADM, Supermarket to the World, and Merrill Lynch. For clients around the world, we make a difference.
To me, wisdom means having the wealth of experience that would enable one to see beyond the obvious.
Wisdom comes from insight.
Beginning with Good Morning America with Lisa McRae and Kevin